Hello, this is Dr. Grande. Today I will analyze the sentencing of Sarah Boone. First, I'll look at the background of this case, move to a summary of the sentencing hearing, then offer my analysis. Sarah Boone lived with her boyfriend, George Torres, in Winter Park, Florida, near Orlando. On February 24, 2020, she called 911 and indicated that George was dead. The police found that George had been zipped in a suitcase and died from positional asphyxiation. Sarah claimed they had been playing a game of hide-and-seek. She zipped George in the suitcase, believing he could unzip himself and escape. She went to bed and found him dead the next morning. The police found 2 cell phone videos that Sarah had recorded of her taunting George when he was trapped in the suitcase. She was charged with second-degree murder. In a very unwise and shocking decision, Sarah turned down a plea bargain for manslaughter, which would have resulted in a 15-year prison sentence. Instead, this case moved forward to trial, which started on October 14, 2024. By this time, Sarah had changed her story and was arguing that she killed George in self-defense. Her argument was that she had developed battered spouse syndrome. Sarah was not technically a spouse, but the syndrome can affect anyone in a romantic relationship, regardless of marital status. During her trial, Sarah Boone testified on her own behalf, and it was disastrous for her case. She claimed that on the night of the killing, she and George were playing around when she zipped him into the suitcase. At this point, George became mean. Sarah left him trapped because she was afraid that if she let him out, he would kill her. Perhaps without even realizing it, Sarah sort of confessed to murder on the stand. Under cross-examination, the state highlighted how Sarah did nothing to help George, thereby cementing this idea that she did in fact commit murder. During closing arguments, the state did a great job of pointing out how Sarah did not act in self-defense. Sarah's attorney argued that leaving George to die in the suitcase was the act of a battered spouse. George was responsible for his own demise because he caused Sarah to be afraid for her life. Using a suitcase for self-defense may have been unconventional, but it was warranted. Sarah had enough, she fought back, and she survived. On October 25, 2024, the same day as closing arguments, the jury found Sarah Boone guilty of second-degree murder. She was sentenced on December 2, 2024. Here is a summary of the sentencing hearing. Much of this is paraphrased. Sarah took the stand. She stated that she had plenty of time to think and had a lot of things to say. She intended to offer a statement using a document she had with her, then an apology without using notes. The document she had was an edited version, one that was shorter than the original. Sarah described the statement she was about to give as the tip of the tip of the tip of the iceberg. The statement started off with a reference to ceramics. Sarah talked about how the cracks in ceramic artwork make it a new piece of artwork. This was a metaphor for her life experience. Sarah claimed that she had been damaged by George Torres, the Torres family, the criminal justice system, and social media. She was the victim of defamation, and her constitutional rights were violated. Sarah believed that forgiveness leads to healing, and she wanted to forgive. First on her list was George Torres. She forgave him for every time he slapped, kicked, punched, stabbed, dragged, threatened, degraded, and laughed at her. Sarah continued with the list of items to be forgiven, including George beating her senseless, destroying her television, wrecking her townhouse, breaking her cell phone, going into drunk rages, drowning her in liquor and wine that she did not want to drink, destroying her reputation and integrity, being deceptive, using her debit card to buy alcohol, and causing her to be arrested for murder. Sarah then shifted her attention to George's family, saying that she forgave them for knowing George's history of violence and not helping her. She forgave them for caring too late. The next part of Sarah's forgiveness tour was social media. Presumably, she was talking about people who use social media and who posted information about her. She forgave them for being greedy, insensitive, deceptive, exploiting her predicament, broadcasting and manipulating her case online, and condemning her in the court of public opinion. Sarah was upset that she could not be forgiven and move forward. Social media users interfered with her getting a fair, proper, uninfluenced, and successful conclusion. She forgave the media tycoons for not having a life of their own, for making themselves seem right by making her appear wrong, and for hypothesizing, scrutinizing, and blaspheming. It sounded like Sarah believed she was a deity. The last person Sarah wanted to forgive was herself, for not choosing her life sooner, for not being braver, more vigilant, bolder, more outspoken, and stronger. Sarah forgave herself for not realizing she was enduring a life of domestic violence, for not escaping permanently, and for not fighting back sooner to save herself. She said, "I forgive myself for falling in love with a monster." Sarah tried to break the spell so George would not be a monster anymore, but she was not successful. She believed that she and George shaped each other into brilliant pieces of art from the cracks and repairs. Sarah never stopped loving George, looked forward to meeting him at the gates of heaven, and was haunted by him. George was everywhere. Everything reminded Sarah of him. For example, seeing her stab wound. Sarah's request was for the entire planet to forgive her. Her apology was profuse and ceaseless. She wanted a second chance, repentance, and redemption. Her mission going forward is to help domestic violence survivors. Sarah suggested that if she had been the one who died, the world would remember her as a darling mother and celebrated Woman of the Year. Sarah said, "I am a survivor." At this point, Sarah stopped reading and offered a final statement without using notes. She stated that she loved George. The scars on the outside of her body, except for the stab wound, have healed, but inside the scars have changed her as a person. She indicated that she would forever have George Torres with her in her heart, mind, body, and soul. In what I suppose was an effort to be poignant, Sarah talked about how, when she left the courtroom, it would be forever. She concluded with, "I ask for forgiveness." Sarah's attorney asked her one question about spirituality. Sarah answered it by saying that prison has been one of her greatest experiences. It gave her time to reacquaint herself with God. Sarah's desire was to draw people to her because of the light. Sarah's 20-minute rant did not appear to impress the judge. Ultimately, Sarah Boone was sentenced to life in prison. With only a few exceptions, in the state of Florida, life in prison means life without the possibility of parole. Now moving to my analysis. Sarah had an interesting journey through the criminal justice system. For instance, she had 9 different attorneys. This number was so high, in part due to Sarah being unhappy with several of them. In June 2024, Sarah sent a 58-page letter to the judge, which I covered in a separate video. Among other things, she wanted to be listened to, respected, and treated fairly. She said, "I refuse to be moved in wanting respect no matter who everyone thinks I am." Sarah was mad that information about her case was online and that people knew details about her case before she did. She felt like she had already been convicted and was tired of people using their freedom of speech. What I find interesting from the letter, all the way through the sentencing hearing, is how Sarah's complaints really haven't changed much. She has been remarkably consistent. When Sarah rejected the plea deal, it was a turning point in her case. Up until that point, people wondered if maybe she was just being difficult in an effort to get a good deal. By rejecting a great deal, the best deal she could have ever hoped for, Sarah made it clear that she was fully committed to a tactic of self-destruction. The sentence would have been 15 years, but when factoring in time served and gain time, Sarah would have been out in 8 years. Instead, after being convicted at trial, Sarah Boone will die in prison. One could argue that, essentially, Sarah paid with her life to get one last chance to rant to a wide audience. If she admitted guilt and took the deal, all this could have been avoided. But that was not a good bargain for Sarah. That is not what she wanted. This desperate need to be heard should not be particularly surprising because this is a pattern with Sarah. For instance, at her trial, Sarah's defense argued that when Sarah had George trapped in the suitcase, she experienced a moment of power, which she used to vocalize her feelings. This was her big chance to have George listen to her. If Sarah was willing to kill a man just to make him listen to her, then it stands to reason she would be fine with life in prison to make the world listen to her. Sarah's rant during her sentencing hearing would probably be her last widely attended performance. This was her final chance to get what she paid for. She was willing to do life. In exchange, she was permitted to make one dramatic argument that no one would forget. Sarah did not fail to deliver. The primary message of Sarah's final statement was how she was a victim whose primary mistake was loving too much. The speech was framed as an exercise in forgiveness, but really it was Sarah going on the offensive. This was her last chance to strike out against everyone: her murder victim, George, his family, the criminal justice system, everyone on social media, and the entire population of the planet. She wanted people to know that she carefully thought through her statement. This was not haphazard, sloppy, or spontaneous. Sarah knew exactly what she was saying. Each word was deliberately selected. Despite this, somehow, there was a lot more information that Sarah did not bring up. Below the surface, there were enough grievances to fill an ocean. She had so much to share, it was impossible to share all of it. Sarah could keep talking for hundreds of years if she needed to. The opening statement, during which Sarah listed every bad thing that George ever did, was designed to make a critical point. George was a terrible person who victimized Sarah. Not satisfied with dragging George through the mud one last time, Sarah went after his family. In her mind, they ignored her cries for help. If only they would have listened to her, all this could have been avoided. Sarah rebuked social media users and essentially blamed them for her conviction. Without them, she could have had a successful conclusion to her case. I would argue that Sarah being convicted was a successful conclusion, but I'm sure Sarah would disagree. It was at this point that Sarah elevated herself to the rank of deity, accusing social media users of blasphemy. Maybe she would settle for being a saint, like Saint Sarah, the Suitcase Suffocator. Consistent with Sarah's theme of forgiveness, she forgave herself for not realizing she was a victim. There is no doubt that she realizes it now. It's all she ever talks about. I guess she learned the lesson well. In a particularly curious statement, Sarah mentioned not fighting back sooner. She appears to be justifying the murder. It's almost like she doesn't regret committing the murder. She regrets not killing George sooner. Sarah referred to George as a monster, only to romanticize her relationship with him. He haunted her. She would meet him at the gates of heaven. She never stopped loving him. She could never forget him for so many reasons, including the stab wound. Even though Sarah spent a lot of time digging herself in a hole with the speech, she did request forgiveness at the end. It seems kind of insincere after blaming everybody but herself. Maybe she felt like she was obligated to ask for a second chance. Maybe the judge was in a generous mood. I think one thing that really bothered Sarah was how people have refused to view her as the victim, like when she pointed out that if she had died, she would have been celebrated. Maybe by antagonizing the judge and just about ensuring a life sentence, Sarah was figuratively dying. She was making a statement as dramatic as death, therefore challenging people to accept her as a victim. Maybe now people would understand how hard this has been for Sarah. At the end of Sarah's glorious time on the stand, she defiantly declared that prison was one of her greatest experiences. I guess serving life in prison is like receiving a Lifetime Achievement Award. Considering she will be there for life, Sarah should be prepared for even more greatness. She will get as much greatness as she can handle. This was Sarah's way of saying, no one has taken anything from me I did not want to give. Nobody was victorious over her. She is perfectly fine with dying in prison. In her mind, she put the world on trial during her own trial. Her sentencing was a point of shame for all the people who victimized her. One could also look at this from an insight perspective. To Sarah, being sentenced to life in a physical prison does not matter because she is already serving life in a prison of no insight. This case reminds me of the phrase, "Is this the hill you want to die on?" This is often used when a person is expending a lot of resources to argue over an insignificant or difficult to defend position. For Sarah, as long as the hill promotes the idea that she is a victim, the answer to this question is always yes. Those are my thoughts on the sentencing of Sarah Boone. Thank you so much for watching. I'll talk to you soon.